Hello everyone, my name is Rosemary Milsom. Welcome to Kambali 2020, a Rebuild Bali Festival. The digital program is designed to connect us and I suppose inspire us at what is a really tough time for many people, and particularly offer our support to the Balinese community, who've always been very generous and kind to me. I've been visiting Bali many times in the past 25 years, and I actually went to the first Ubud Writers and Readers Festival way back, and I'm so glad that Janet Deneve and her team have decided to present this digital program. The festival is going to hopefully unite people at this really challenging time, and we're going to have an international audience at a time when we can't get on a plane necessarily and travel anywhere, but we can have conversations, and we can travel through conversations. The festival has been brought to you by the Patrons Program. If you want to find out more about that, you can head to the Ubud Writers Festival website. And I encourage you to join us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram during this festival. Welcome to today's session, which is Sand Talk, how Indigenous thinking can save the world. And it's a very, very important topic, a very timely topic. And before I introduce our special guest, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wabakal and Warramai here in Newcastle, Australia, and I treasure this landscape. I'm near the Hunter River, not far from my house, and I feel very privileged to live here. I also want to acknowledge elders, past, present, and emerging here in the Newcastle community, and also acknowledge Aboriginal people who might be listening today and engaging in our conversation. Now to our guest. This brilliant book came out a year ago. Tyson Yunkaporta is the author, and I read it a year ago and I've revisited it in the past few days, and it's interesting because I've changed in the past 12 months, the world's changed in the past 12 months. So I'm keen to revisit this in my two experiences of this book. Tyson is the author, and he's also an academic, an arts critic, and he belongs to the Appalachian clan in far north Queensland. He's also an artisan. He carves traditional tools and weapons, and he also works as a senior lecturer in Indigenous knowledge at Deakin University in Melbourne, where he speaks to us today. Thank you for joining me, Tyson.
Hey, how you going, Rosemary?
I'm really well. Look, I have to start just by asking you, you're in a place that's had some of the toughest COVID restrictions in the world, and community's been locked down with family, and I just wonder how you're faring, how the family faring during this really tough time.
Yeah, all right. I think most of the people in Melbourne, we're on one of the most extended lockdowns on the planet right now, and so people are feeling sorry for themselves, but I think most of the people living in Melbourne are doing a hell of a lot better than most of the other people in the world. I think the worst of us, what we're experiencing on lockdown here is still a hell of a lot better than a lot of people in Indonesia are going through most of the time. So I couldn't be sitting here in this bubble of privilege in this metro, bastion of the Anglosphere, this outpost here, and sort of be feeling sorry for myself. It is hard, like as an Aboriginal person, not to have access to country anymore, and not to be able to, go outside and connect in that same way, or to leave this putrid city and try and connect with something real. That's been difficult for me because the universities have been closed all year. So I've been in this chair all year and working full time from home, and so is my partner, and we've also got two babies. So that's 24/7. We have sort of 22-hour days and like a little bit of sleep.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, both of our babies are that particular kind of genius that only needs a few hours sleep. Yeah. But, I'm not complaining. And I'd like to acknowledge where we are. And both of us, and also where this message is going, because we have a long history, with Indonesia on this continent, much longer than that predates, the British and the French and even the Dutch from 500 years ago coming here. Our relations with Indonesia go back far longer. So even in my family's language, Wikmungkan, we have a few words from there that are in our language. So the word for periwinkle is remat, and the word for porpoise or dolphin is otmet. And we've got several words like that that clearly come from Indonesia. But I'm 3,000 kilometers to the south of my mob now. I'm in Melbourne, so that's a long way away. But those song lines that we have, they connect us from north to south, and the song lines go under the ocean, and they go right up. And we have some of our hero ancestors on this continent are beings and entities that are still in that landscape, and they came south from there, and those song lines are still running under the sea. So we have a dreaming relation there, and we also have a history, probably 1,000 years or more, of trade, with Indonesia and up into New Guinea and all that part of the world, where we were trading lots of things. So a lot of our dugout canoe design, comes from that part of the world. A lot of our all kinds of things, tobacco, alcohol, steel, the tamarind tree, dingoes even. So dingoes were part of that trade with Asia as well. Coming to here, we have that same dreaming through that dog, which is one of the only 2 placental mammals that are native to Australia, us humans being the other one. So we have that really strong relation going all the way up, and we have a lot of the same experience of interaction with the Anglosphere, and with that age of imperialism, and that same sort of histories, kind of genocidal histories going way back, but then also military interventionism. If you look at the military intervention in Northern Territory, etc., a lot of the optics when you look at those photos are the same as what you see from that part of the world up there too. And Timor and all that kind of thing. You look at some of those optics, some of those photos, and you're not quite sure which which is which, because there's coconut trees in both photos, and Australian military uniforms and big guns and yeah. So anyway, I just want to say hello from where I'm sitting, and lucky to be on Bunurong country, lucky to be in a room that I can have to myself for a little while. That's huge. Most people in the world don't have that luxury. There's there's a lot of people who think they're doing it. Yeah, a lot of people who think they're doing it tough from their own room that they don't have to share with 12 people at the moment. Not in our communities, of course. Particularly our remote communities. It's like half a dozen mattresses on the floor in every room. So So we're not really doing it tough. I think all the bubbles of privilege and illusion around the world are contracting at the moment, and I think as we move through this 10-year depression that we're entering now, a lot of those illusions will come apart, and we're either going to have to find ways to become more interdependent and collaborative around the world, or we're going to have to start killing each other more. which, I think October, November, we'll probably see a bit of that exploding too, but we can get back to that later if you like.
Yeah, okay.
We're here to talk about books though, aren't we?
Yeah. I was going to say, thank you for, talking about that connection with Indonesia, because for me, your book is all about connection. At the core of it, my reading of it is connectivity, and how, in a sense, that is completely essential for sustainability. If we're looking at a future, we're trying to navigate this really quite devastating time on so many levels, particularly with the environment and as you said, conflict. It goes on. We've seen a lot of conflict, particularly in America, the past few months. It's been really hard to watch. To watch that even from this far away. Your book, to me, is an exercise in humility. It's about being prepared to have a dialogue. And I know it's the written word, and I know that's in a sense so limited, and it's not like this where we can talk, but it's an invitation. Why was that important to you? Why was that important to you to invite us, to take part?
Yeah. Well, look, we live within complex systems, complex systems of land, but also, economies and different movements and social systems and things like this. These are all complex systems, and they have a kind of order poiesis, where they almost have their own big mind, these systems. So order poiesis, that just means they can be self-correcting, self-managing. These systems kind of manage themselves. That's what complexity is. And a lot of the problems we have are actually complex problems that have so many moving parts, and they have origins in different parts of the system that you can't even see half the time. And here's the thing: the only way we can actually interface with those systems and with those problems is through an aggregate of minds. You can't have one committee or one person or one leader or group of leaders, a G bloody 9 or G20 or G100 or whatever, trying to figure that out. It's got to be lots of stories coming together, and they have to be diverse. And I say story because that's how we perform that action. Through the generative practice of yarning. That's how we as human beings do this. We sit together, lots of different people with different narratives, and we form an aggregate of narratives. And some of those are outliers, and some of those are similar to each other. But when we have powerful thought is when there's lots of diverse narratives coming together. And even where they're contradictory, they still sit together comfortably. And that's when you get the complexity of story. And then, of course, arising from that, the complexity of thought, that allows for some kind of meaningful interface with the complex adaptive systems that we live in. So if you want to solve the world's problems, you have to be working like that.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, you talk about the elements, I suppose, of Indigenous thinking, Indigenous culture, and in a sense, what it does is hello. What it does, what you're talking.
Yeah, there you go.
Who is this?
The whole internet just saw up your nose, Bubby. Can you go? Okay. Yeah, we did. Oh, closing. Wait, mamaka.
I suppose what you do in this book is show up all the limitations of Western thinking, with this notion of Western culture, which is, I suppose, grounded in hierarchy and survival of the fittest, and I'm greater than. You talk about that, and ego. and narcissism and imbalance of power, and Western sort of thinking and processes thrive on imbalance of power. And in a sense, what you're proposing, I mean, with this book and with Indigenous thinking, it's radical. It's radical when it's set up against, the sort of Western ideas and limitations.
Well, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with true Westernism. Like the actual cultures of the West are good, strong, beautiful things. The actual cultures, the root cultures, foundational cultures, what people have in their homes and their lives and what they carry internally, and the old stories, the proper stories, but there's been a catch-all. See, I was talking about those stories before, but there's good story, but then there's also wrong story. And we've been manipulated by wrong stories, like big grand narratives that have forced us all under the same sort of ideological blanket. And we all follow a couple of those big bad narratives. And when I say we all, I mean even our Indigenous community in Australia. A lot of us, most of us have actually taken on board those narratives. And, it's those Hobbesian narratives of primitivism. We've taken on this idea that today is better than yesterday and tomorrow will be better than today. That's that arrow of progress. So, and this is grounded in a foundation that we're all coming as humans from a primitive and brutal past. And, it's just not true. Not at all. There was something you said in that question that I wanted to get to. What was some of the language you used at the start?
I was talking about the sort of Western idea of hierarchy and power, and you reinforce that notion of greater than, and for me to be greater than, you have to be less. And ego too, ego, and you also talk about within Indigenous thinking, within in culture, that notion of having to keep ego in check and narcissist in check. That narcissism isn't just inherent in Western culture. It's in people. It's in all of us. It can it's to me what you explore in this book, and the way Indigenous thinking is sort of the opposite of that almost, that it's really radical. It's radical if you're looking at it through the Western, eyes. It's quite radical.
Yeah. Well, look, it's and look, I mean, I think an actual Western lens coming from the actual foundational culture would have no problem with any of it. But it's just this sort of recent thing that's been pulled over everybody's eyes, and it's come out of this. That's right. You said survival of the fittest. Okay, this is really important. There's been this game theory, this game theoretical perspective that's been developed, from about mid last century, and it's kind of ruined everything. Now, pretty much most of the disciplines on the planet right now, psychology, just literary theory, governance, economics, every single thing is grounded in this wrong story. Everything's grounded in a theory of evolution, which in the strand of the human evolution side of that story, there is some just wrong baseline data there. There's been a fantasy projected back onto our Paleolithic past, which is wrong. And everybody who still has, every community that still carries some memory of being, living on a land base in sustainable relation to that land base knows that it's wrong. So let's just take that. One of the main parts of it is this idea of survival of the fittest, but particularly fight or flight. So you hear that all the time, hey? So they use that in the software development. That's the base of the theory. That informs every choice in every line of code and in every interface that's developed for how to hijack our limbic systems, etc. It's all based on this idea of fight or flight or freeze. Basic responses to pleasure and pain, all these just stimulus, but every single person who retains that memory, every community that carries that memory of what was, understands that fight or flight is not the reality. We were not walking around as human beings for 1 million years, just in a constant state of hypervigilance, never knowing when a tiger might jump out and eat us. Just absolute rubbish. That's not our relationship with predators. Predators that are, what they'd call more apex than we are. Our relationship with those predators is very different. And here's the key to it. You can ask anyone in India, Asia, anywhere. We always know where the tigers are.
Yeah, so it's denying that knowledge, isn't it? It's fight or flight. It's denying that knowledge and understanding of your environment and your connection with your environment.
That's it. You always know where the tigers are. You always know where they are. But furthermore, you have a totemic relationship with those predators. There's this idea that's been put forward of morphic resonance, where every being that's of basically the same shape sort of shares information in spirit, with other beings of that same shape. But in actual human cultures, that have that totemic kind of tradition, which is all human cultures at its base, we have more of a polymorphic resonance. So the animals that you have a particular relationship with totemically, you are connected to them as well. And you understand them and you share information with them and know where they are. So, for example, right across the north coast of Australia, you go to any community there and you try to find one account of an Indigenous person that's ever been taken by a crocodile. And it's never happened. It doesn't happen. Tourists get taken by crocodiles all the time. So you have this fantasy projection where, domesticated humans project themselves back into a Paleolithic wilderness landscape, and they try and imagine what that would be like. And all they can imagine is absolute terror. And so they make the assumption based on no evidence that all human existence has been terror. And then they go, well, there was no rule of law. So what would I do if I was suddenly, dropped in the wilderness with a bunch of people with no rule of law? Well, I would start killing people and raping like a maniac. So I'm going to assume that, like,
That's, this is really interesting, because this underpins so much cognitive. Everything that we understand about how we operate. And isn't it interesting? I've never thought about it. In a way, what you're talking about is that, in the past, however, we're going to say a couple of 100 years or so, 100 years, we talk about stress and the stress response and rising cortisol levels, and we're all getting fat because of stomach fats because of rising cortisol levels, et cetera, et cetera. But that's because of the life we're living. That's because of, we're living in big cities, isolated from family, isolated from connection, because all we do is get on Facebook and, and so so what you're saying is that's a myth. It's a myth, and it's like a couple of the myths that you really try to get us to think differently about in this book. I mean, there's so much. As I said at the beginning, I find reading this book is an act of humility. I feel, I don't know, I read it and I feel it reminds me a few years ago, I went to the Northern Territory and part of a leadership thing, and we stayed. Went to Catherine Gorge, and we did a trek, and it was meant to challenge us and I don't know, put us out there in the wilderness, all that kind of thing. This notion of I don't know what you meant to learn from most of the women in the group. It was January in the NT, Darwin. Most of the women in the group fainted. So I don't really know what we're meant to learn from that. But when we got back into Darwin, we went to Noongalinga College and did some cross-cultural kind of awareness. And I remember Rosie, and I'm called Rosie, one of the women who was talking us through kinship, and we did it for a couple of days. We were sitting out under the trees, and I just felt overwhelmed, overwhelmed with lack of understanding, overwhelmed with just, I know so little, and also overwhelmed with what the hell are we Anglos doing here? That feeling that I've had a few times when I visited other parts of Australia. And Rosie said, you're feeling good, you're thinking you have some understanding now. And I said, oh yeah, I do. The complexity of kinship and she was standing in front of this tree, and this gum tree, and she said, yeah, that's culture, that's us. And she pulled one leaf off and said, there you go, that's what you understand now after a couple of days. And in a sense, reading this book again and revisiting it, it took me back to that moment. That must be 15 years ago or so, of just trying to understand. And you do it in a way that is the most kind of I don't know, you don't shy away from the complexity. I suppose that's what I'm saying. And I you differentiate between complex and complicated. And what you're exploring is complex. It's it's not complicated. So, and I'd like to clarify that. I don't want people to start thinking that you can't understand this book, you can't engage with it. You can, and it's on a level that I've never really grasped before. Sorry?
Is that as far as you went with it? Sorry, before you get away from that leaf, because that was important. Is that as far as you went with that message? That you only know this much in comparison to that much? Or did you keep sitting with that and find more?
I kept sitting with that and found more. And the day later, we were introduced to some women from the Tiwi Islands and I remember walking into the room, and I've traveled a lot, and I'm a journalist. I interview people all the time. Being able to converse with someone is part of what I have to do. And I walked into this room with these amazing women, and we're going to do some weaving with them. And I sat opposite them, and I just sat. The journalist in me always wants to talk, and hello, how are you? And I'm Rosemary, and and where are you from? And after that day, the tree, I sat with these women, and I didn't, that part of me just became quiet. And
that's the part that can interface with the pattern of creation. But see, the pattern of the tree is in that leaf. You might think, some people might think that's just a leaf. That's not the tree, but that's the tree too. So the pattern in that leaf, when you start to look at it, it's like it's fractal and it goes out. It's the pattern of the entire tree is in that leaf. So then you look from the leaf to the tree, and you see that pattern keeps going out. It keeps spiraling out, and you'll see the pattern of that tree going right out to all the other trees, and then the entire system where that tree is the dominant species there, you'll see that entire area, and then that bioregion, you'll see that. That's,
and you know what I saw?
But then you keep looking, and that bioregion is actually syndicated. connected, networked out to all the other bioregions too. And then you start to perceive the entire continent with that pattern. And then you go on those songlines under the sea and you start to, that goes right around the world, the pattern again. And then you look to the night sky and then you see that pattern again. So then you start to see it going right through the universe. And so you got that universe right there in that little leaf. And so the fragments of who we were 5 minutes ago, it's still like, a handful of leaves inside of us, and that doesn't mean that's gone, because you can find it there. You've got fragments inside of you. You've got, your great grandmother, maybe even your great grandmother was a woman, in Bosnia, who was probably, she didn't have a fight or flight relation with the bears there. She'd have been following the bears in the forest because the bears would be showing her what to eat. The bears have the same diet as human beings, so she'd be following them in different seasons to find the clues of what fungi to get that are best on that particular day. She'd be following all those signs that way, and that's that relation. And that's so you can see all of the patterns that would be coming out from her experience of foraging in the forest that way, and all the sign that she would have been seeing and bringing in, and that's in you. You might have never seen a bear before, but there's fragments of that in you. And, and that's not unrecoverable. And that's not applicable only to that bioregion right there on the other side of the world. There's a pattern there of a process of relating to and reading country and reading signs in the landscape. That's a process that you've inherited. That's your birthright as a human being, as the organism that we all are. Anywhere that you would land, anywhere on the planet, you would be able to start reading that landscape and coming into a communion with it and finding your way through it and caring for that place so it can care for you. That's what we do as human beings. Now, and we've been doing it for a very, very long time, so, and I don't think that we came out originally from Africa. I think there's really strong evidence to show that we human beings came out from Asia and Australia, and there's 7 bloods of humanity, and there were lots of branches of that all around the globe. And Homo erectus in Asia, in this region here, and Gondwana and all that sort of thing, 1 million years ago were carving abstract designs and doing symbolic reasoning on shells. They've found those shells and they're 1 million years old. So we're an organism that's been making meaning and story and acting as custodians for at least 1 million years, probably longer than that. And when they found that Homo florensis, that what they're calling hobbits.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah.
The shorter.
When they found that old man Juma, in my book, he was like, yep, that's that other blood there. There's 7, because you see all the, genetic scientists, they're going, okay, well, there's what we're calling Denisovans, and, we have no idea who they were, but they're finding all these, genealogies, in our bloods. And, and then when that came up, old man said, oh yeah, that 7th one there, that's them little people. And you tell me one place in the world that doesn't have story about those little people. You tell me one culture that doesn't still have little people's story. So this idea that, Western culture is this disconnected thing, there's little people's story in Western culture. There's also 7 sisters story for the Pleiades, and that exists all around the planet. They had that story in ancient Greece. They had that story in Africa. They have that story in Indonesia, all around. 7 sisters. There's not even 7 stars in that constellation. So how are we all around the planet looking at that and seeing 7 and calling them sisters, and then having the same story that it usually involves one of them getting left behind and a body of water, etc. we're all coming from a common origin story, and we all still hold fragments of that. And so old man Juma, he did the symbols. He did those symbols in my book, and it was the reason why I did the book, was as a delivery system for those symbols.
Yeah,
That's
I
a
thought I might
ritual
share
magic. It's a ritual magic that he did, that he says will bring the 7 spirit families home and together, and create this harmony, bring all those stories together again.
And this is one of the symbols you use in the book. I wanted to show that this is what I valued. Your explanation, and throughout the book, and sand talk, that's the notion of, you're drawing a meaning in the sand to share with people, and pass on that knowledge and share that knowledge. The visual elements were the parts of the book that really resonated with me. And you're talking about the leaf and that gum tree. A couple of days after that, we flew to Weipa, and as we're flying over from Darwin, after being in Darwin, the rivers and the branching out, I mean, that's the leaf too. That's the pattern of that leaf, those veins almost of that leaf, and the way the main river, I'd never seen that from the air. I'd never flown over that part of the country before, from Darwin to that part. And it was, January, so lots of water around, and seeing the tiny little tributaries going out, like, and it reminded me of the lung. When you see a drawing in biology at high school, and you see the drawing of a lung, and a lung is just little tributaries and little branches that go out. And, so, that connect, I saw that, and I understood that. And so, and you make the point too in your book that so much of Aboriginal art is from the air, that aerial view, that, flying over of the landscape. And until you do that, and you fly over and you see, I mean, I've just been lucky through work to travel a lot, and that part of the country, and to see that for yourself, you're glued to the window of the plane. Like, you just think, oh my goodness, this is it. And how could they see that from the ground? These artists were working on the ground, but it's just because of knowledge. They have that aerial perspective, through the eagle, through that totemic relationship, through that connection. It's not the way we see it, where we have to be elevated physically, and this is about that mind connection.
Well, it's not the way we're told we see it, but you're able to talk and think and remember things, like, clearly, because you wouldn't be able to speak to me right now, and you're able to do that because of your human cognition, and human cognition is spatial. You are located, and therefore you are conscious. You're able. Human memory is located. It's based on inner mappings that is that. So the fact that you're able to remember anything is based on this navigational mind. And that's check out the neuroscience on this, the science of memory, any of the brain science you want to look at, or neuroscience, and you'll find that that's true, and that's supported in the literature and the research, is that it's your spatial relationships that allow you to think and to remember. There's 2 things, but they're interrelated. There's there's place and there's story. So narrative is part of your memory system, but that's interwoven like a double helix, with location. So you are constantly forming and making these inner maps, even with abstract concepts. You're doing that all the time. I mean, and the fact that, we're painting it like that, and we're talking it up like that, it doesn't make our cognition any different from yours. That's human cognition. We just a lot of us have not yet accepted the false narrative that humans don't think like that. The false narrative that we think in reductive ways, and we only see one point in time and space, and we focus on that. and we do our job and we achieve our outcomes. And we tick them off these fucking
I was going to say,
KPIs.
we tick those boxes.
Yeah.
We tick those boxes.
That's an illusion, and that's a trick, and it's a very recent one. And I mean very recent, like over the last century. You know, the idea of nations. How old do you think nations are?
Oh, 100 years old, so?
Yeah, that's all. But we're all tricked into believing that this is a natural method of human organization that's existed since the dawn of time, to the point that even as Indigenous people, we talk about ourselves being First Nations now, even though the concept of a nation was not a form of governance until about a century ago. You know, and there was a big trick that was pulled, because a century ago, most people on the planet were still living on the land. Not many people realize that. Most people were still living in profound relation to the land. You know, even if you were working in industry, that was dictated by you having to be out in the countryside somewhere where there was a waterway that had a water wheel, you know, to power the machinery. You know what I mean? Yeah. So even in England, you know, people were still living, you know, a village lifestyle in a landscape. Everywhere on the planet, there was only a handful of people who were disconnected. And they were the ones, you know, driving the machinery of trying to, you know, get the rest of this thing in place so that they could control more and more people. So they formed nations as a way of controlling not just the serfs on their land, but as a way of controlling millions and millions of people all at once, and making them think all the same way, speak the same language, have roughly the same ideology, and do what they're frickin' told. And they tricked us into thinking the way we think is focusing on just what's in front of us, just the job to do, just the person to shoot. If you know, one of these people that's been conscripted into a standing army, you know, shoot them, make this, but not even make this, you know, we don't even make things anymore. We make part of something that we don't know what it is and then pass it on to the next person in the line. We don't know where it's going. We don't know where it's come from. We're supposed to just focus on that. So this idea of, you know, oh, people, Westerners think differently. I don't think so. Just Westerners believe more wholeheartedly that that's the natural way to think. And that's only because of just, you know, massive abuses and trauma that's been going on a little bit longer than the rest of us have had to suffer in. So yeah.
You also refer to, you know, writing. So that writing and the limitations of writing. And I'm just trying to find. I took a note. You know, that you write that because in a way what you say is that the written form and the written word is another form of limiting us and confining us and almost imprisoning us in you know, contracts and you know, you have to sign this, and so it's a form of
that's
control.
The future. Yep.
And you write that sometimes it's hard to write in English when you've been speaking to your great grandmother. In her language, there are no separate words for time and space. I mean, that's just one example of how the oral tradition, the oral, you know, telling story, and then I had to laugh at another point where you talk about, you know, that writing is seen as something valued now. And you know, while you've made a career of writing, you know, you still can't buy a new car, etc. This hard-won skill, you know, this skill, and I had to kind of laugh at that because you know, I'm a journalist. I haven't, and look at what's happened with print media. I've always been a print journalist, and you know, we're all being made redundant, and what I do is not really have any value anymore. And I've often asked myself, after I stopped being a journalist 5 years ago, I walked away from it, that you know, where did all the stories go? Where did all the stories go? I think of the thousands of words I wrote and the people I spoke to, and I sometimes just have that question: where did all the stories go? And in the
You
way
trust it
Aboriginal
as
people
print.
would see it. Those stories are there, they go on, they shared their, you know, that juxtaposition of the journalist's job, which is all about story, and the way you live and the way Aboriginal people have lived for millennia. Story doesn't live or die. You know, it evolves, it adapts. It's and then that's indicative, I suppose, ultimately of the core beliefs, isn't it? That the culture adapts and lives and changes and evolves. It's not fixed. It's not rigid. We don't tick boxes. You know, you don't tick boxes in
And
Aboriginal
just
kind of culture.
I mean, just even the idea of that our culture is an oral culture, you know, that's a really limiting idea too, because, you know, we're more of a non-verbal culture than we are a language-based culture anyway too. I mean, I would call us a multimodal culture, would be more accurate, you know, because we use a lot of our communication is done with visuals and gestures and non-verbals, but it's also, you know, the bulk of our communication is in shared context. You know, we have shared understandings of a context that we're in and we're living, you know, in constant communication with a communicative landscape, and that's coming through us all the time, you know. And so it's a lot more dynamic than just this idea of, you know, so a print-based culture looks at us and go, well, they don't have print, so we'll call them an oral culture, because that's how they do their print, oral. And then they tell stories at night, and, you know, and then it's Chinese whispers until all the real knowledge gets lost forever. And that's just it's just not true. You know, the only way to store knowledge long term is in those, you know, that intergenerational, you know, transmission of knowledge that is not captured or kept, you know, in any particular material form, like a page or even digital. You know, it's a terrifying thing to me to see how, you know, you mentioned our adaptive nature, and that's true. But some of us are not thinking that through. And we're going, well, we have this digital technology now, so we'll adapt and we'll put all of our Indigenous knowledge onto this database. And it's like, yeah, well, we adapt because we're interacting with these databases and this digital technology. That's true. But don't be trusting all of our knowledge to a electronic database, because that is only going to last for as long as rare earth metals last. Yeah. I mean,
You in a sense, you've
or
got a database.
as long as a particular kind of operating system lasts. I mean, how much all right, how much of the data that you stored on floppy disks back in the day still exists?
0.
Yeah. Do you even have a computer with a floppy disk thing? So, you know, you probably had boxes full of floppy disks, you know, and so half of your stories that you trusted to those things, they're gone. You know, let alone the fact that, you know, rare earth metals are called rare for a reason. They're not going to last forever.
Yeah.
And, you know, and even if they did, the radioactive waste that's produced in refining those metals will kill us long before, you know, long before we've even run out of those things anyway. You know, it's not sustainable. It's not a safe place to trust all of your knowledge. You know, once you try to capture knowledge, you know, in print or image, and you put it on a screen or a page, you've already killed it. You know, and that's, I guess that was my struggle with the book, was to try to find a way to store the knowledge in objects and relationships, and then just reference aspects of that knowledge in a kind of translation into, you know, symbols on a page that represent speech sounds that are not, it's not definitively showing Aboriginal knowledge or anything. It's just trying to use an Indigenous lens to look at the rest of the world. And it's also an invitation for people to bring their story and sit alongside all those stories, You know, they bring their story in. So there's no two people who read the book the same way. You know, everybody reads the book differently and they find different things in there. And people will often say to me, oh, I love the bit where you said X, Y, Z. And I'm thinking, yeah, I didn't say that anywhere in that book. Because they've brought their story so profoundly in that they've read and they have a memory of reading something that is just their own story, you know, in there. And so I love that. I love talking to people, yarning with people. And as we go along, you know, so it's what, a couple of years ago now I wrote that book. It's obsolete now. The actual story is a living body of knowledge globally that's existing in multiple yarns in this network all around the planet, and it's growing all the time. And I'm not even involved with 99% of those. And those yarns are growing and growing and growing, you know, in the weirdest contexts. So extreme right libertarians, you know, extreme left social justice warriors, and everything in between. You know, rich people, poor people, you know, Anglo people, others, everyone all around, they all bring in that story and they're growing it bigger. And it's not about the book. It's about, once again, it's that old man Juma's ritual magic with the symbols that are in the book. And I guess you think of that as a delivery system, the book. Even if print in the first place is a bit toxic, you know, I guess it's a bit like, you know, a vaccine or fluoride or something that that can only be delivered. It needs to have, you know, aluminium or mercury or something in it to help carry that that chemistry across into where they want to deliver it. You know, sometimes you got to add some toxic stuff to actually put the good stuff in that'll make the change. Not that I'm saying fluoride's good stuff, but I think fluoride is a neutral compound, but sometimes the stuff they have to mix it with to make it work is
damaging.
And I feel that way about my book. It bothers me in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's like, meh. Well, you know, most delivery systems for healing are going to do a bit of harm as well at the same time.
We went. I mean, this conversation's kind of, you know, meandering, taking its own path. But
we got about 5 minutes too.
The book actually is. It does have structure. I think one element that talking to other people that they've appreciated is the way you explore the 5 forms of Aboriginal knowledge. You know, kinship mind. And that's knowledge through that connection, through relationships, story mind, which we've talked about, you know, narrative, and dreaming mind, which, you know, is sort of, I suppose, abstract, you know, metaphor, and then ancestor mind, which is, you know, you write, you know, a way of thinking which is about connecting with a timeless state of mind or alpha wave state, and then pattern mind, which is, you know, that idea of finding patterns and trends and using them to make you know, big picture predictions and solutions, you know, finding solutions to problems. And I could see so clearly the value or the how it could be applied. I mean, to anything from, you know, a couple of community organisations I'm involved in. You know, when we gather and sometimes things aren't working, and sometimes it's hard to put it. And we often say conflict. Oh, it's a conflict problem. We need conflict resolution. It's conflict. And actually, I often sit back and think, no, I don't know if it's conflict. I don't know if it is necessarily that. I think though the way you describe, you know, that form of knowledge, sometimes it's just that we're coming at something, or, you know, whatever it is, an idea or a problem, or we're just coming at it with a different mind. Like it just, you know, when you say, oh, they don't speak my language, you know, they just weren't on the same page. So often we think that we then say, well, that's a conflict. But I could see so much value in what you write about, and you explore those types of knowledge. And, it's what you're doing is applicable to what you write about is applicable to like small community groups, huge corporations, it's government to the way a school operates to, like it's so multifaceted. And
look, all those stories coming together, it, in that way as an aggregate, and each person's story being able to sit, in the shoes of another person's story, etc., and them all coming together and everybody being able to see from every angle in a bigger mind. There's a tradition of that in Western culture, and it's called the Socratic dialectic. It's and that's a couple of thousand years old at least. So I mean, look, the idea that the West is evil and Western culture is evil is kind of wrong. It's just been a handful of oligarchs, who are doing that. And almost there's an intergenerational equity problem too with the boomers and the silent generation right now, trying to hold on to all their stolen wealth, at the expense of everything alive on the planet, coming into their children and grandchildren's generations, which probably won't go much further than that if we can't, knock them off their thrones. It's not a problem with Western culture. Western culture at its foundational story is good. And it's just a few people who've injected wrong story into that. That needs to be weeded out. That needs to be changed. And that's it. And that's something we need to be able to do together. But if we're being laterally violent to each other and we're looking side to side going, oh, well, this white one here is evil and this black one here is probably violent, and we're doing that back and forth, and we're not actually seeing, we're not looking up. We need to get out of this idea of this is the Anthropocene. It's not the anthros that did this. It's the arseholocene. There's a handful of arseholes who've done this to us with wrong story, and it's a bad magic, and we need to reverse that. That's it.
And that there's that connectivity that you write about, and as I said, I think very early on, what's essential to that is empathy. And I've commented a few times in the past few months, COVID hasn't just sort of, taken lives. It's kind of killed empathy, and I've seen a lot, where's your empathy? And I've made that comment. It just feels like, I don't know, with the stress of COVID and anxiety around it, we've let go of that empathy towards one another. And
well, that's a good place to end. This, I think, is coming back to that first question that I didn't really answer about narcissism. We don't have that. That narcissism is that illusion that you're special. And that's what you're supposed to learn on your first rite of passage as a young person. Your first initiation ceremony. That's when you're supposed to learn that you're not special, but you belong to something special. And that old lady who gave you that leaf, that was an invitation. And that was real, and that was an invitation to come back, to come home, to come back into and under the law of the land. And if we can't bring every human being back under the law of the land and do that soon, then everything and everyone is going to die. So it's kind of important. But then that gives us a challenge as Aboriginal people too, because we've, had so much trouble and suffered for so long. All of a sudden there's this tiny little thing that we're respected for, this idea that we're special and we have a special relation to the landscape. We have a special relationship with land and nature. And a lot of us are holding on to that, and we don't want to share because that's all we've got. That's our only capital, is this mythology that we're a special kind of human being biologically that has some magical relationship to land. But that's all of us as human beings. And Aboriginal people who still have that, we need to bring everybody else home and back under that law, or everything's finished. But that means we need to let go of our own narcissism as well. That some of us,
I'm not greater than.
Yeah. And that old lady, she had none of that. She offered you that invitation to come back under the law of the land, and she wasn't doing it, as some like gammon ceremony for Rio Tinto where she was getting paid $5,000 to do a welcome to country and handing you a gum leaf. She was doing it the right way, and she meant it, and that's where we got to go.
Tyson, I could talk all day.
Are we out of time?
We are out of time, and look, we've just touched on really just some of the ideas explored in Sand Talk. Really, you should read it. And what happened with my copies, I read it a year ago, and it went to a friend, and it's gone to another friend, and then my son, and then another friend, and I had to get another copy because I want that other copy to keep going and on its journey, and this one will go off on another journey as well. And thank you so much. It's been just fantastic talking to you, and hopefully we will cross paths again in real life at some point.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for listening, and keep tuning in to this fantastic Kambali 2020 festival. And if you want more information about the Patrons program, which has made this event possible, you can visit the Ubud Writers Festival website. Thanks very much.